Welcome to HOA Boardroom Battles. The string line went up, and so did her voice. I will make sure the vendor sees this. Karen shouted that she would call management and have my project shut down before lunch. Her face was red, her clipboard was shaking in her hand, and I was standing in my own front yard with a tape measure and a bundle of fence pickets that had been on the curb for maybe an hour. I am an IT compliance auditor, so I speak in policies and logs, and none of this was making sense. The Aspen Hollow Reserve Association in Fort Collins, Colorado, had approved my fence permit 3 weeks ago. I had the signed form, the city code confirmation, and the contractor lined up to start Monday. But Janet Garcia, the special assessment coordinator for the HOA board, was standing on the sidewalk screaming that I was dumping illegal materials and violating setback rules that did not exist in any document I had ever seen. The time pressure was real. The HOA was threatening collections language, and I needed to stop it before it impacted my credit. My job requires clean background checks, and a collections notice would trigger an internal audit review that could cost me clearance access. Janet knew that. She had told me 2 weeks ago during the application review that any unpaid assessments would go to collections within 30 days, and she would make sure it moved fast. Now she was manufacturing a violation out of thin air so she could start the clock. I looked at the pickets on the curb and then back at her. They had been delivered an hour ago while I was measuring the property line. The delivery driver had stacked them neatly on the grass strip because the driveway gate was locked. I told her the materials were temporary and would be moved into the backyard before end of day. She cut me off and said that was not good enough. I will make an example out of you so everyone learns. That was her line, and she said it twice in the first 5 minutes. Janet pulled a camera out of her blazer pocket and started taking pictures of the picket bundle from different angles, crouching low to make it look like the pile was bigger than it was. I asked her what rule I was violating. She said dumping construction materials on HOA common property, which made no sense because the grass strip was city property and the pickets were not blocking the sidewalk. I pulled out my phone and opened the PDF of the approved fence application. I showed her the stamped approval signature and the compliance note from the Architectural Review Committee. She barely looked at it. She said the approval was for the fence design, not for material staging, and that I should have requested a separate staging permit. I asked her to show me the staging permit rule in the handbook. She said it was in the supplemental guidelines that were distributed at the annual meeting. I had been at that meeting. There were no supplemental guidelines. Janet stood up and tucked her phone away. She said she was filing an immediate compliance violation, and that I would receive a notice by end of business today with a $200 fine and a stop work order until the materials were removed and a corrective plan was submitted. I told her that was insane. She smiled and said the board would back her because they were afraid of her. That line stuck with me. It was not a threat, it was a confession. She was admitting that she had leverage over the other board members and could push through anything she wanted. I made a mental note of it and kept my face neutral. I asked her if she wanted me to move the pickets right now. She said no, because the violation had already occurred and moving them would not erase the photographic evidence. I asked her what the corrective plan needed to include. She said a written apology, a timeline for material removal, and a $50 administrative processing fee on top of the fine. A golf cart with a blinking amber light rolled up behind her and stopped at the curb. It was one of the HOA courtesy patrol carts, the kind that cruise the neighborhood looking for violations and checking gate access. The driver was a guy in his 20s with a radio clipped to his belt. He leaned out and asked Janet if everything was okay. She waved him off and said she had it under control. The cart idled there for a moment, the amber light blinking slowly, and then it rolled away down the street. I watched it go and realized it was the third time I had seen that cart in my neighborhood this week. It felt like surveillance. Janet turned back to me and said I had until 5 p.m. to submit my corrective plan or the fine would double. I asked her where I was supposed to submit it. She said email, but the board email address was not monitored on weekends, so I would need to send it to her personal email and copy the management company. I gave her a small thank you, because she just handed me leverage. I asked her to spell her email address. She rattled it off, and I typed it into my phone. I asked her if she wanted me to CC anyone else. She said no, just her and the management company, and if I tried to go around her to the board president, she would escalate the violation to a hearing and push for a lien. I nodded and said I understood. I did not understand, but I knew I needed to buy time and figure out what she was really trying to do. The fence project was legitimate. The permit was valid. The materials were temporary. None of this should have triggered a violation, let alone a stop work order and a fine. Something else was going on. Janet walked back to her car, a white SUV parked 3 houses down, and drove off. I stood in the yard for a minute trying to process what had just happened. Then I called my contractor. His name was Mike, and he had been building fences in Fort Collins for 15 years. I explained the situation, and he sighed. He said this was not the first time the Aspen Hollow Reserve Association had pulled something like this. He had worked in the neighborhood twice before, and both times the HOA had tried to stop the project with bogus violations and last-minute rule changes. One of those projects had been shut down entirely after the homeowner gave up and paid the fines. The other had dragged on for 3 months and ended with the homeowner selling the house and moving out. Mike said he would still start on Monday if I wanted, but if the HOA issued a stop work order, he would have to pull his crew until it was resolved, or he would risk losing his city contractor license. I told him to hold off until I figured out what was happening. He said he understood and that he would keep the materials staged at his yard until I gave him the green light. I thanked him and hung up. Then I opened my email and started drafting the corrective plan. I kept it short and factual. I acknowledged that the materials had been temporarily staged on the grass strip. I explained that they had been delivered while I was measuring the property line and that I had planned to move them into the backyard before end of day. I provided a timeline. Materials would be relocated by 6 p.m. today, and the fence installation would proceed on the original schedule starting Monday morning. I attached a copy of the approved permit and the city code confirmation showing that the HOA had no authority over temporary material staging on city property. I sent the email to Janet and copied the management company. Then I started digging. I pulled up the Aspen Hollow Reserve Association governing documents and searched for any mention of material staging, construction dumping, or temporary storage. Nothing. I searched the Architectural Review Guidelines. Nothing. I checked the meeting minutes from the last annual meeting. There was no mention of supplemental guidelines. I pulled up the county property records and confirmed that the grass strip between the sidewalk and the curb was city right-of-way, not HOA common property. Janet had lied. The violation was fake. The fine was fake. The stop work order had no legal basis, but that did not mean it would not cost me money and time and stress. The HOA could still process the fine, send it to collections, and force me to fight it through arbitration or small claims court. And in the meantime, my contractor would be stuck waiting, and I would be burning through the narrow window I had for the project before winter hit. By 6 p.m., I had moved the pickets into the backyard and stacked them along the fence line where the new posts would go. I took photos with timestamps and emailed them to Janet with a note confirming that the materials had been relocated per the corrective plan timeline. She did not reply. The management company sent an auto reply saying they were closed for the weekend and would respond to inquiries on Monday. I spent the rest of the evening searching for anything that would explain why Janet was targeting me. I pulled up the HOA financial disclosures and found something strange. The special assessment line item had tripled in the last year. Janet, as the special assessment coordinator, had pushed through 6 emergency assessments in 12 months, all for vague infrastructure repairs and legal fees. The total was over $40,000 spread across 80 homes. That was $500 per household in extra charges on top of the normal dues. And there was no detailed breakdown of where the money had gone. I started taking notes. I made a list of every assessment, every fee, every administrative charge that had been levied in the last year. Then I cross-referenced it with the meeting minutes. Half of the assessments had been approved at board meetings with no quorum. The minutes listed 3 board members present, but the bylaws required 4 for a valid vote. That meant the votes were not legally binding. The assessments were not valid. And if the assessments were not valid, the HOA had been collecting money under false pretenses. That was fraud. I saved the spreadsheet and the minutes to a folder and backed it up to the cloud. Then I emailed my ally. His name was Ray, and he was the neighborhood security guard supervisor. He had been working in Aspen Hollow for 5 years and had seen every ridiculous HOA stunt Janet had pulled. I asked him if he had a few minutes to talk. He called me 10 minutes later. Ray said Janet had been running the board like a personal fiefdom for 2 years. She had taken over the special assessment coordinator role after the previous coordinator resigned, and since then she had pushed through more fines, fees, and emergency charges than the previous 3 coordinators combined. Ray said she had a reputation for targeting homeowners who questioned her or pushed back on her authority. She would manufacture violations, stage photos, and escalate minor issues into hearings and liens. Most people just paid the fines and moved on because fighting her was too expensive and too stressful. But Ray said there were at least 3 families in the neighborhood who had documentation of her abuses and were waiting for the right moment to file a formal complaint with the management company or the state HOA oversight board. He said if I was willing to push back, he would help me gather evidence and connect me with the other families. I told Ray I was in. He said he would send me contact info for the other families and that he would keep an eye on Janet's movements over the weekend. He also told me to watch out for retaliation. Janet had a habit of escalating when someone challenged her. She would stack violations, ban people from amenities, or push for lien filings to force compliance. Ray said she had tried to have his security company contract terminated twice because he had refused to enforce bogus parking violations she had invented. Both times the management company had sided with him, but it had been a fight. He told me to document everything, keep copies of every email and notice, and record any in-person confrontations if Colorado law allowed it. Colorado is a one-party consent state, so I could legally record conversations as long as I was part of them. I thanked Ray and hung up. Sunday morning I got an email from Janet. The subject line said final notice, and the body text was 2 paragraphs of legalese threatening a hearing if I did not submit a revised corrective plan with a formal apology and the $50 administrative fee. She said the original corrective plan I had submitted was insufficient because it did not acknowledge the severity of the violation or demonstrate a commitment to future compliance. She also said the stop work order was still in effect and that any construction activity on my property before the hearing would result in additional fines and possible legal action. The email was copied to the management company and to someone named Patricia, who I assumed was another board member. I read it twice and then forwarded it to Ray. He replied within 5 minutes and said this was classic Janet escalation. She was trying to bait me into either paying the fee or lashing out so she could justify the hearing and the lien. I did not reply to Janet. Instead, I called the management company and left a voicemail explaining the situation and requesting a copy of the supplemental guidelines she had referenced. I also asked for clarification on the quorum requirements for special assessment votes and requested a detailed breakdown of how the 6 emergency assessments from the last year had been spent. Then I emailed the City Code Enforcement Office and asked for confirmation that the HOA had no authority over temporary material staging on city right-of-way. They replied Monday morning with a short email, confirming that construction material staging on city property was governed by city code, not private HOA rules, and that as long as the materials did not block pedestrian or vehicle access, no permit was required. I saved the email and added it to my evidence folder. Monday morning, Mike called and asked if he should bring his crew. I told him to wait. I explained that the HOA had issued a stop work order and that I was waiting for the management company to respond. He said he understood, but that he had another project starting in 2 weeks, and if this dragged on, he would have to bump my fence to late October. That would put me right up against the first snow, which in Fort Collins could come as early as mid-October. I told him I would have an answer by end of week. He said he hoped so and hung up. I sat in my kitchen staring at the calendar and running the numbers. If I fought this and lost, I would be out the fines, the hearing costs, the attorney fees, and possibly the contractor deposit. If I paid the fines and moved on, I would be out $300, and Janet would have a win on record that she could use to justify doing the same thing to the next person. Neither option felt good. Then I got a call from Patricia, the board member who had been copied on Janet's email. She introduced herself as the board secretary and said she wanted to talk off the record. I said okay and asked if I could record the call. She hesitated and then said no, she would prefer to keep it informal. I agreed but took notes. Patricia said she had been on the board for 4 years and that Janet had become increasingly aggressive in the last 18 months. She said Janet had pushed through the special assessments without proper votes and had used intimidation and threats to keep the other board members in line. Patricia said she had tried to raise concerns internally, but that Janet had shut her down and threatened to file a complaint against her for interfering with board duties. Patricia said she was planning to resign at the next annual meeting, but that she wanted to help me if she could. She said the stop work order was not valid because it had not been approved by a majority vote of the board. Janet had issued it unilaterally. I asked Patricia if she would be willing to put that in writing. She said no, not yet, because she was afraid of retaliation. But she said if I filed a formal complaint with the management company, she would support it quietly and provide documentation if it went to a hearing. She also told me to look into the minutes and quorum logs, because she was certain that at least 3 of the 6 emergency assessments had been approved without a valid quorum. I thanked her and asked if there were other board members who felt the same way. She said yes, but they were even more afraid than she was. Janet had made it clear that anyone who opposed her would be targeted next. Patricia said the only way to stop Janet was to force a recall vote or to get the management company to remove her for misconduct. Both options required hard evidence and multiple complaints. One homeowner pushing back would not be enough. I spent the rest of Monday gathering evidence. I pulled the meeting minutes for every board meeting in the last year and cross-referenced them with the bylaws. 3 of the emergency assessments had been approved at meetings with only 3 board members present. The bylaws required 4 for a quorum. That meant those votes were invalid. I documented each one in a spreadsheet with dates, amounts, and attendee lists. Then I pulled the financial disclosures and found something else. 2 of the emergency assessments had been labeled as legal fees, but there was no corresponding invoice or case number in the financial documents. The money had been paid to a law firm, but there was no detail on what the legal work had been for. I emailed the management company and requested copies of the invoices. They replied Tuesday morning and said they would need board approval to release financial documents to a homeowner. I replied and said the bylaws allowed any homeowner to request financial records with 5 days' notice. They said they would check with the board and get back to me. Tuesday afternoon, Janet sent another email. She said the hearing had been scheduled for Thursday evening at 6 p.m. at the clubhouse. She said I was required to attend and that failure to appear would result in an automatic ruling in favor of the HOA and immediate lien filing. She also said I was not allowed to bring an attorney unless I notified the board in writing at least 48 hours in advance. The email was cold and procedural, and it felt like a trap. I forwarded it to Ray and asked him what he thought. He said it was a setup. Janet would stack the hearing with board members who supported her, present the staged photos and the bogus violation, and push for the maximum penalty. Ray said I should bring a witness and record the hearing if possible. He also said I should demand that the hearing be postponed until the management company responded to my records request, because I had a right to review the governing documents and financial records before defending myself at a hearing. I replied to Janet and said I was requesting a postponement until the management company provided the financial records and the supplemental guidelines she had referenced. I said I had a right to review all relevant documents before the hearing and that proceeding without them would violate my due process rights under the bylaws. I copied the management company and Patricia. Janet replied within an hour and said the postponement request was denied because the violation was time-sensitive and the board had already scheduled the hearing. She said if I did not attend, The ruling would proceed in absentia. I printed the email and added it to my evidence folder. Then I called an attorney. His name was David, and he specialized in HOA disputes. I explained the situation, and he listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said I had a strong case for both the invalid stop work order and the fraudulent assessments. He said the quorum issue alone would be enough to void the assessments and possibly trigger a state investigation. But he also said fighting it would take time and money, and that HOAs like Aspen Hollow often drag cases out to exhaust the homeowner. David said he could represent me at the hearing for a flat fee of $500, or he could file a formal complaint with the state HOA Oversight Board for $1,500. I asked him what he recommended. He said it depended on how far I wanted to take it. If I just wanted to stop the fence violation and move on, the hearing might be enough. But if I wanted to expose the fraud and force accountability, the state complaint was the better option. I told him I would think about it and get back to him. He said he understood and that he would be available if I needed him Thursday. I thanked him and hung up. Then I sat in my kitchen and stared at the calendar again. The hearing was Thursday. The contractor window closed in 2 weeks. The collections threat was still hanging over me. And Janet was escalating. Wednesday morning, I got another surprise. A sudden gust snapped the string line I had set up to mark the fence alignment, and before I could retie it, Janet pulled into my driveway. She got out of her SUV holding her phone and started recording. She walked up to the snapped string line and said this proves I was reckless and that my project was unsafe. She said she was filing an additional violation for failure to secure construction materials and that the new fine would be $300. I asked her how a string line snapping in the wind was my fault. She said I should have used stakes with higher tension ratings and that the bylaws required all construction staging to meet safety standards. I asked her to show me the safety standards in the bylaws. She said they were in the supplemental guidelines. I asked her to send me a copy of the supplemental guidelines. She said she already had, and that if I could not keep track of my documents, that was my problem. I pulled out my phone and started recording. Janet noticed and said I was not allowed to record her without consent. I told her Colorado was a one-party consent state and that I was part of the conversation. She said that did not matter because we were on HOA property. I told her we were standing in my driveway, which was private property. She said the driveway setback was HOA common area and that I was violating the privacy policy. I asked her to show me the privacy policy. She said it was in the bylaws. I had read the bylaws 3 times. There was no privacy policy. Janet turned and walked back to her SUV. She said the additional violation would be in writing by end of day, and that if I showed up at the hearing with an attorney, she would push for a permanent ban from all HOA amenities. Then she drove off. I called Ray immediately. He said he had just seen the golf cart with the blinking amber light cruise past my street twice in the last hour. He said it felt like coordinated surveillance, and that Janet was probably building a case to justify the hearing and the lien. Ray said he would come by Thursday morning to check the property line and make sure there were no other bogus violations Janet could manufacture. I thanked him and told him about the snap string line. He laughed and said that was the most ridiculous thing he had heard all week. He said wind gusts in Fort Collins could snap a string line even if it was tied to steel posts, and that no reasonable person would call that a safety violation. He said it was pure harassment and that I should document it in my complaint. I added the incident to my evidence folder and took photos of the snap string line and the stakes. Then I retied the line and added extra tension. Wednesday afternoon, I got the email from Janet with the additional violation notice. It was formatted like an official legal document with numbered paragraphs and a breakdown of the alleged safety failures. The fine was $300 and the deadline for payment was Monday. If I did not pay, the amount would double and go to collections. The notice also said that the stop work order was still in effect and that any attempt to proceed with construction before the hearing would result in immediate lien filing. I read it twice and felt my blood pressure spike. This was not an HOA enforcing rules. This was extortion. Janet was inventing violations, stacking fines, and using collections threats to force compliance. And she was doing it because she knew most people would just pay and move on. But I was not most people. I forwarded the notice to David and asked him if this crossed the line into harassment. He replied within an hour and said yes, absolutely. He said the pattern of escalating violations, the manufactured evidence, and the retaliation for requesting records all pointed to bad faith enforcement. He said if I wanted to file a formal complaint with the state, he could have it ready by Friday. I told him to go ahead and prepare it. He said he would need copies of all the notices, emails, meeting minutes, and financial records. I sent him everything I had. He said he would review it and call me Thursday morning before the hearing. I thanked him and tried to get some sleep. I did not sleep much. Thursday morning, David called and said the complaint was ready. He said it outlined the invalid quorum votes, the fraudulent assessments, the harassment pattern, and the retaliation for requesting records. He said once it was filed, the state HOA Oversight Board would open an investigation and the management company would be required to freeze all enforcement actions against me pending the outcome. He said it would take 2 to 3 months to resolve, but that it would stop Janet in her tracks and force the board to answer for the financial irregularities. I asked him if I should still go to the hearing. He said yes, because skipping it would give Janet ammunition to claim I was refusing to cooperate. He said I should attend, state my case calmly, and let Janet dig her own grave. He also said I should bring Ray as a witness and record the hearing if the board allowed it. I called Ray and asked if he could come to the hearing. He said yes, and that he would bring a copy of the HOA patrol logs showing that the golf cart had been dispatched to my street 6 times in the last week, all at Janet's request. He said that would help establish the harassment pattern. I thanked him and spent the rest of the morning preparing. I printed copies of all the notices, emails, meeting minutes, financial disclosures, and the city code confirmation. I organized them in a binder with tabs. Then I wrote a short statement outlining my position. The violation was fake, the stop work order was invalid, the fines were fraudulent, and Janet was retaliating because I had requested financial records. I kept it calm and factual. No emotion, no accusations, just documentation and timelines. At 5:45 p.m., I drove to the clubhouse. Ray met me in the parking lot. He was wearing his security uniform and carrying a folder. He said he had the patrol logs and a signed statement from one of the other guards confirming that Janet had requested multiple drive-bys of my property in the last week. I thanked him and we walked inside. The hearing room was a small conference room with a long table and 8 chairs. Janet was already there, sitting at the head of the table with her clipboard and her phone. 2 other board members were seated next to her, a man in his 50s and a woman in her 60s. Patricia was not there. I asked where she was. Janet said she had recused herself due to a conflict of interest. I asked what the conflict was. Janet said it was confidential. Ray and I sat down across from the board. Janet opened the hearing by reading a prepared statement outlining the violations: illegal dumping of construction materials, failure to secure staging area, safety hazard due to snap string line, and refusal to comply with corrective plan requirements. She said the total fines were $500 and that the stop work order would remain in effect until the fines were paid, and a revised corrective plan was submitted with a formal apology. She said if I refused to comply, the HOA would file a lien and pursue collections. Then she asked if I had anything to say. I opened my binder and started. I said the materials had been staged on city property, not HOA property, and that the city had confirmed the HOA had no authority over temporary staging. I showed them the email from code enforcement. Janet said the email was irrelevant because the bylaws gave the HOA authority over all construction activity affecting neighborhood aesthetics. I asked her to show me the bylaw. She flipped through her clipboard and pulled out a highlighted page. She read a sentence about architectural review authority. I said that was about permanent structures, not temporary material staging. She said the board had the discretion to interpret the bylaws as needed. I asked if the interpretation had been voted on. She said it had been discussed at a board meeting. I asked which meeting. She said she would have to check the minutes. I pulled out the minutes from the last 6 board meetings. None of them mentioned material staging or interpretation of Architectural Review Authority. Janet said the discussion had happened in executive session. I asked if there was a record of the executive session. She said executive session minutes were confidential. I moved on. I said the stop work order had been issued unilaterally by Janet without a board vote, which violated the bylaws requirement for majority approval of enforcement actions. Janet said emergency violations could be issued by any board member. I asked her to show me the bylaw. She said it was implied in the enforcement section. I said implied was not the same as written. The other 2 board members shifted in their seats. The man in his 50s, whose name was Tom, asked Janet if she had consulted with the rest of the board before issuing the stop work order. Janet said she had notified them after the fact. Tom said that was not the same as getting approval. Janet said it was an emergency, and there was no time. I asked what the emergency was. She said the materials were a safety hazard. I asked how a neatly stacked bundle of fence pickets on a grass strip was a safety hazard. She said someone could trip. I asked if anyone had tripped. She said that was not the point. Ray cleared his throat and said he had been patrolling the neighborhood for 5 years and had never seen a material staging incident result in injury or complaint. He said the only complaints he had seen in the last week were from Janet, and that all of them had been about my property. He handed me the folder with the patrol logs. I passed copies to the board members. Tom read through the logs and frowned. He asked Janet why she had requested 6 drive-bys in 1 week. Janet said she was monitoring a high-risk situation. Tom said the logs showed no high-risk indicators and that the requests had come in every day, sometimes twice a day. He asked if that was standard procedure. Janet said it was her discretion as Special Assessment Coordinator. Tom said Special Assessment Coordinator was a financial role, not an enforcement role. Janet said she was also on the Architectural Review Committee. Tom asked if the committee had voted to classify my project as high risk. Janet said the committee had discussed it. Tom asked for the minutes. Janet said she would have to check. I could see Janet losing control of the room. Tom was asking questions she could not answer, and the woman next to him, whose name was Linda, was flipping through the bylaws with a confused expression. I decided to play the trump card. I pulled out the financial disclosures in the meeting minutes. I said I had noticed that 3 of the emergency assessments from the last year had been approved at meetings with only 3 board members present, which was below the quorum requirement. I said that meant those votes were invalid and that the HOA had collected over $15,000 under false pretenses. Janet's face went red. She said the quorum requirement did not apply to emergency votes. I asked her to show me the bylaw. She said it was in the emergency procedure section. I said I had read the emergency procedure section and there was no exception for quorum. Tom asked to see the minutes. I handed him copies. He read through them and then looked at Janet. He said she was right that 3 of the meetings had been below quorum. He asked why she had not called for a vote to ratify the assessments at the next full meeting. Janet said it had not been necessary. Tom said it was absolutely necessary and that failure to ratify could expose the HOA to liability. Linda asked if the management company had been notified. Janet said she had handled it internally. Tom said that was not proper procedure and that the management company should have been consulted. He asked me if I had filed a complaint. I said yes, and that my attorney had submitted it to the State HOA Oversight Board that morning. The room went silent. Linda asked if I was serious. I said yes. She asked what the complaint alleged. I said fraudulent assessments, harassment, retaliation, and bad faith enforcement. Tom asked if I had documentation. I said yes, and I handed him a copy of the complaint. He read through it and then set it down. He looked at Janet and said this was a disaster. He asked her if she had discussed any of this with the management company or the HOA attorney. Janet said she had not needed to because she was following the bylaws. Tom said she clearly was not, and that the board was now facing a state investigation and possible legal action because of her decisions. Linda said she wanted to call an emergency board meeting to review the complaint and discuss next steps. Tom agreed. Janet said the hearing was not over and that I still owed the fines. Tom said the hearing was over and that all enforcement actions against me were suspended pending the outcome of the investigation. Janet stood up and said she would not let me get away with this. She said, "I will make an example out of you so everyone learns." Tom told her to sit down. She refused. She said the board would back her because they were afraid of her. Tom said that was no longer true. He said he was tired of her intimidation and her unilateral decisions, and that if she did not step back, he would call for a vote to remove her from the special assessment coordinator role. Linda said she would second that vote. Janet looked at both of them and then looked at me. She said this was not over. Then she grabbed her clipboard and walked out. The door slammed behind her. Tom apologized to me and Ray. He said the board had been trying to rein Janet in for months, but that she had threatened retaliation against anyone who opposed her. He said the state investigation would force accountability and that he hoped it would lead to structural changes. Linda said she was sorry I had been targeted and that the board would issue a formal retraction of the violations and refund any fees I had paid. I thanked him and asked about the stop work order. Tom said it was voided as of that moment and that I could proceed with the fence project. He said he would send a written confirmation to my contractor by end of day. I thanked him again, and Ray and I left. If you are enjoying this story, please hit like and subscribe for more wild HOA drama. Outside the clubhouse, Ray shook my hand and said that was the most satisfying hearing he had ever witnessed. He said Janet had been untouchable for 2 years and that watching her lose control in front of the other board members was long overdue. I thanked him for the patrol logs and the statement. He said he was happy to help and that if I needed anything else, he was available. Then he drove off in his security truck. I sat in my car for a minute and exhaled. The hearing had gone better than I expected. The stop work order was voided. The fines were suspended, and Janet's power was crumbling. But I knew she would not let it go. Tom had said this was not over, and I believed him. Friday morning, I got an email from the management company. They said they had reviewed the complaint and the hearing notes, and that they were launching an internal audit of all financial transactions from the last 18 months. They said Janet had been removed from the special assessment coordinator role pending the outcome of the audit, and that all enforcement actions she had initiated were under review. They also said the board was scheduling a special meeting to discuss governance reforms and that all homeowners were invited to attend. The meeting was set for the following Thursday. I replied and said I would be there. Then I called Mike and told him the stop work order was voided. He said he would bring his crew Monday morning and that we would have the fence done by end of week. Monday morning, Mike and his crew showed up at 8 a.m. They unloaded the posts, the panels, the concrete mix, and the tools. Mike walked the property line with me and confirmed the measurements. Then they started digging post holes. By noon, they had 6 holes dug and the first 2 posts set in concrete. I stayed in the yard and watched. Around 1 p.m., the golf cart with the blinking amber light rolled up and stopped at the curb. The driver was the same guy from before. He leaned out and asked if I had a permit. I showed him the approved permit and the email from Tom confirming the stop work order had been voided. The driver radioed someone and then nodded. He said he was just checking and that he would make a note in the log. Then he drove off. Mike laughed and said Janet must be fuming. By Thursday, the fence was done. It looked great. The posts were straight, the panels were level, and the gate swung smooth. Mike took photos for his portfolio and I paid him the balance. He said if I ever needed another project done, to call him first. I thanked him and he loaded up his truck. That evening, I drove to the clubhouse for the special meeting. The parking lot was full. I walked inside and the conference room was packed. There were at least 50 homeowners, plus the board members, the management company rep, and an attorney. Tom called the meeting to order and explained that the board had completed an internal audit and found multiple financial irregularities. He said 3 of the emergency assessments had been approved without quorum. 2 of the legal fee assessments had no corresponding invoices, and several administrative charges had been added to homeowner accounts without proper authorization. He said the total amount in question was over $20,000. Tom said the board was recommending a full refund of all invalid assessments, plus interest, and that the management company would be issuing corrected ledgers to every affected homeowner. He also said the board was recommending a vote to remove Janet from the board entirely and to implement new oversight procedures for financial decisions. The attorney explained that the state investigation was ongoing and that depending on the findings, there could be criminal charges. Tom asked if anyone had questions. A woman in the back stood up and asked where Janet was. Tom said she had resigned from the board effective immediately. The room erupted in applause. Another homeowner stood up and said he had been fined twice by Janet in the last year and that both fines had been bogus. He asked if those would be refunded too. Tom said yes, all fines issued by Janet in the last 18 months were under review and would be refunded if they were found to be invalid. The meeting lasted 2 hours. By the end, the board had voted to refund the invalid assessments, void all of Janet's unilateral enforcement actions, and implement a new financial review process, requiring 2 board members to approve any assessment or fine over $100. They also voted to hire an independent auditor to review the HOA books and ensure no other irregularities had been missed. The attorney said the state investigation would take another 2 months, but that the preliminary findings supported the board's decision to remove Janet and refund the assessments. Tom thanked everyone for attending and said the board was committed to transparency and accountability going forward. The meeting adjourned, and people started filing out. Ray found me in the hallway and said this was the best outcome he had seen in 5 years. He said Janet's reign of terror was over and that the neighborhood could finally move on. Over the next few weeks, I got 3 more emails from the management company. The first was a formal apology for the harassment and the invalid enforcement actions. The second was a corrected ledger showing that the $500 in fines had been voided and my account was clear. The third was a notice that the state investigation had concluded and that the HOA had been fined for governance violations. The notice also said Janet had been issued a written warning for harassment behavior and that she was banned from serving on any HOA board in Colorado for 3 years. The attorney explained that the warning was part of a settlement agreement and that it would be on record with the State Oversight Board. I saved all 3 emails and closed the folder. The fence stood solid through the fall and into winter. Every time I walked out the front door, I saw it and remembered the fight. Not the stress or the sleepless nights, but the moment in the hearing room when Tom told Janet to sit down and she refused. The moment when her power broke. I had gone into that hearing expecting to lose, expecting to pay the fines and move on, but I had come out with something better. Accountability, transparency, and a neighborhood that was finally free of someone who had spent 2 years terrorizing anyone who questioned her. Ray told me later that 3 other families had filed complaints with the state after my case went public, and that all 3 had been resolved in favor of the homeowners. The special meeting had turned into a recall vote, resignations had cascaded, and new leadership had taken over before the next project got targeted. Janet never came back to a board meeting. I saw her once at the gas station lot at the edge of the subdivision about a month after the hearing. She was sitting in her SUV with the engine off, staring at her phone. I pulled into the lot to get gas and she looked up. For a second, we made eye contact. Then she started her engine and drove off. I never saw her again. Ray said she sold her house in December and moved out of state. No one knew where she went, and no one asked. The HOA removed the enforcement action and voided the ledger entry, and my record stayed clean. My job stayed secure. And the next time someone tried to manufacture a violation, the board shut it down before it went anywhere. I learned something from the whole mess. HOAs run on fear. They count on you being too tired, too scared, or too broke to fight back. They count on you paying the fine and moving on, because it is easier than digging through bylaws and meeting minutes and quorum logs. But if you call their bluff, if you document everything and force them to follow their own rules, the whole structure collapses. Janet had spent 2 years building a system where she could do whatever she wanted, and it had taken 1 records request, 1 hearing, and 1 state complaint to tear it down. The leverage I had given her when I asked for her email address had turned into the thread that unraveled everything. And the trump card, the city code enforcement confirmation that the HOA had no authority over the issue, had been the final piece that forced Tom and Linda to see what Janet really was. The fence still stands. The neighborhood is quieter now, and every time I see that golf cart with the blinking amber light roll past, I remember that fear only works if you let it. I will bring you another one next time.